"This comic book is rare," or "Get this book now, it's scarce." If I had a nickel for every time I heard that, well, I'd buy a lot more comic books. The truth is that most comic books from 1970 forward are not rare. And that includes your beloved copy of New Mutants 98, which came out in 1991. Cool book for sure. It features the first appearance of Deadpool, our favorite wisecracking mutant, but the book ain't rare. For perspective, let's check out how many copies of New Mutants 98 have been graded and then compare that to other books. It has nearly 24,000 copies that have been graded, and over 4,000 have been registered at the nosebleed grade of 9.8. Let's swing on back to 1962 to the Silver Age and look at the census numbers for Spider-Man, his first appearance in Amazing Fantasy number 15. Overall, there are about 3,600 copies that have been recorded, but if you look at the high grades, there are very few. At 9.0 or higher, there are only 24 copies, and the highest are at a 9.6. There are 0 in 9.8. Recall that for New Mutants 98, that there are over 4,000 copies at that nosebleed level. Nevertheless, at best, I will argue that AF-15 is a scarce book, not a rare book. Let's go all the way back to the Golden Age. We'll look at Marvel Comics number 1, which came out in 1939 and birthed the Marvel Universe. Only 65 copies are recorded on the CGC census. And if you look at high grades, 8.0 or higher, only 4 total books are registered. Now, this book is a rarity, especially compared to the other 2 books. And similar to Marvel Comics number 1, comic books that came out in the late 1930s and early 1940s are at least an order of magnitude rarer than Silver Age comic books. You may wonder why these Golden Age books are rarer than Silver Age books and a lot rarer than modern books. Was it the case that fewer of these older books were printed? From what I can gather, most major Golden Age books had print runs that were relatively high, more than 100,000. For example, Marvel Comics number 1 had nearly 1 million copies that were printed. Major Silver Age books had several 100,000 that were printed as well. If you look at a modern book like New Mutants 98, their print runs vary, but NM98 had a print run of about 300,000. The point being is that the print run was higher, if anything, during the Golden Age. So across the hobby, rarity has less to do with the original print run and much more to do with attrition. For modern books, a high percentage survive. And for very old books, only a small fraction remain on the earth today. It wasn't until the late 1960s that many people considered comic books to be collectibles. Up to that point, they were typically considered to be disposable items to be read and thrown out by kids. So the further that you went back from 1970, the more likely a book was to be thrown out. Let's go all the way back to 1939 and imagine what it would take for a copy of Marvel 1 to survive today. Again, and I stress, at the time, comic books were not considered to be collectibles. So it's likely that many were thrown away shortly after they were originally read. If they did survive in the short run, then they had to face World War II a few years later. During this period, America was faced with shortages of all sorts, including paper. And the American Republic responded with gusto with respect to recycling magazines, newspapers, and comic books. Now, if a copy survived that era, then it had to face the 50s. In the 1950s, there was this huge backlash against comic books, mostly due to many of the covers that were being put out in the day. How did the public express outrage? By a good old-fashioned book burning. It was the horror and crime books that took most of the heat, but I'm sure there were a few superhero books that were thrown in for good measure. And perhaps the greatest threat across all those years had to do with spring cleaning year after year for decades by at least 2 generations of moms. And that's why today there are only 65 copies of Marvel Comics number 1 out of nearly 1 million that were originally printed. Put it another way, that's a 99.99% attrition rate. And believe it or not, there are books that are substantially rarer than Marvel Comics number 1. To that end, I've created this video on legitimately rare comic books for your viewing pleasure. And if I'm helping you become a Golden Age rarity snob like me, then please consider subscribing. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and hope to see you around real soon.